Thank you. Well, it's time now for our weekly look at the big stories and the big issues in crime this week. And guiding us through it all, as always, Jackie Haynes, who served with the Metropolitan Police for decades and decades and decades.
150 years.
You're looking very well on it. Look, today we're talking stop and search.
Yeah.
It's something that I guess we're all familiar with. If we've not been stopped and searched, we're normally aware of someone who has. And there's real concerns over the sort of profiling, ethnic profiling that can take place with this. But there is meant to be proper justification for it, isn't there? But
Absolutely, yeah.
doesn't always seem to be the case.
No, I mean, bottom line is, it's a fantastic tool for the police to detect and prevent crime on the street where it really counts. Clearly there has been a huge controversy around who's being stopped and the circumstances around these stops and searches in the street, and it is creating and has created huge tensions over the years. Last year, the Home Office released best practice about how police use these powers. Up in Manchester, we've got the hopefully we got the PCC. I think he's disappeared, but
yeah,
they've been doing some specific work around that, because the Police and Crime Commissioner Tony Lloyd has actually been going out talking to people on the street as to why they're so concerned and upset by the way that police have been using these powers and how they can make it work for everybody.
What do we know, though, about how successful they are in preventing crime or detecting crime? I mean, because there must be a prevention element.
There
within
is,
stop and
yeah.
search.
I mean, there's powers they can use, for instance, special powers. If there's a intelligence, for instance, say around a major event like a football game, where they think there's going to be specific intelligence that there'll be a fight or particularly confrontation between fans, for instance, they can put in a blanket stop and search time within a few hours to say before and after the match they can stop and search whoever they want, but it has to be specifically timed. And then there's additional powers. If a police officer has suspicion that somebody may be carrying a weapon or indeed drugs or stolen goods, then they do have the power. And it's justifying that suspicion where the grey area comes, and where people are very nervous about the fact that particularly young black men are being targeted, and that's what's causing the controversy. We were hoping to speak to Tony Lloyd, but
I think he's ready to go.
Is he? Well,
there he is.
Oh, good morning, Tony. Tony's the Police and Crime Commissioner for Greater Manchester Police. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. You've been taking on this issue of stop and search, as controversial as it is. What feedback are you getting from the public in Manchester about how Manchester Police are dealing with it?
Well, what we're trying to do is to make sure that stop and search is used both proportionately. It is, as you've already said, a legitimate and valuable tool for the police to keep the public safe, and it's important that we remember that. But equally, when somebody is stopped and searched, this is a fairly major intrusion on their liberties. And it's got to be done in a way that's legitimate. In other words, there's got to be proper suspicion where that's the appropriate schedule of the law, but also it's got to be done in an acceptable, respectful and polite manner. So it's really making sure that the management by police sergeants, police inspectors is done in a way that makes sure that stop and search is being used both proportionately and properly. It's also, though, trying to get some feedback from the public, because, of course, actually, almost by the nature of the group of people who are affected by stop and search, they tend not to complain. So we haven't always known what's going on out there on an individual basis, only that, of course, it does do massive damage when done wrongly to the confidence in policing, particularly in areas, not simply, by the way, for young black males. It could be areas where there are Asian populations, but in what would be seen as the traditional white working class areas as well. Stop and search is always something that can, if done wrongly, erode trust in the police, and we can't have that trust eroded.
Tony, what things have you been encouraging the Manchester Police to put into place to increase the faith that the public have in that process?
Yes, well, there are a number of things. One thing, like in common with many police forces, they're now using a system whereby as a police officer stops and searches somebody, they will report in over a radio system to make sure that there is a proper record kept of that stop and search. Not, by the way, in Greater Manchester historically of the individual stopped and searched, but the fact that it took place. The second thing, though, maybe as importantly, I've challenged, and senior police accept the challenge, the need for a much more stringent management. So stop and search and its use is now part of every daily pace setter meeting, the tasking meeting that police officers have in the morning, to make sure that it's done appropriately. And thirdly, one of the things we have introduced, and it's something that young people in particular, but not so young people, might want to pick up, is we've launched an app, a phone app for people's iPhones, mobile phones, etc., which gives people some account of what their rights are under the law, but also importantly allows them to feed back what their own experience is, and their experience as to whether the stop and search has been acceptable in terms of the if you like, the basic human politeness of the exchange, because that feedback, I think, is important as a management tool.
I understand from one of the forums that you've been conducting in Manchester that you received quite a lot of complaints about the process, but none of them were actually filtering through as formal complaints into the police service. Is that something that you hope this app will encourage?
Well, historically, stop and search generates a very, very low level of complaints. I mean, so small as to be almost impossible to determine what the trends are. We've got to do something about that to find out what stop and search looks like out on the streets. We know where it's effective. What's much more difficult to know is where it's damaging, and it is damaging if the relationship between the police and the public is impaired, because actually one bad stop and search, maybe just one police officer who gets it terribly wrong, has an impact not just on the person who stops and searched, but on all their friends, and the folk rumour sends it abroad, massively damaging to policing. That's true of all the big city police forces. So getting that kind of feedback isn't about trying to generate a complaints process. It's trying to generate a process whereby we can have proper management of stop and search, and also to get the culture across to every police officer. Some do it well all the time, we know that, but to every police officer that stop and search is a legitimate tool, but it's only legitimate when it's used proportionately and when it's used in a polite and acceptable fashion. Sometimes it's funny to talk about politeness. Most people who stopped and searched, though, don't find themselves in any way in confrontation with the law, and we've got to remember that. Stop and search, if used against people who it turns out are innocent, has got to be done in a way that leaves them feeling that they maybe don't love the idea, but can accept that it's legitimate to keep the public safe, and that's the big prize. Let's get the public on our side on stop and search. Let's make sure they trust the police to use stop and search in a proportionate and proper way.
Thank you very much, Tony, for joining us, and Stephen, hopefully this is an area which they're starting to get right now to reduce that tension between the police and the young people, which is majoritively who they're stopping and searching, let's face it, and to actually start building the trust back up, but it's going to be a bit of a haul.
It is, but the idea that someone can be stopped and searched and feel like they're just playing their part by having it done willingly, also I guess is quite important. I guess if you're in that situation, it might not be that easy at the time to accept, but it's a good way of thinking if you are faced with that, I guess. Jackie, thank you. More coming up after the break.